A nun is found dead inside a hospital chapel. Strangled and stabbed 31 times. Detectives focus on one priest. Then something happens that still stuns people who know this case. A powerful church leader arrives, the interrogation stops, and the suspect walks out.
I believe there is a cover-up. The church knew what was going on. The diocese knew what was going on. The police department knew what was going on.
For 24 years, the case sits cold until a letter appears containing allegations so extreme, some investigators struggle to believe them. But one name stops them cold: Father Gerald Robinson. What follows becomes the trial unlike anything Toledo has ever seen, and for many a conviction that answered who. But the story isn't only about who, it's about the question that still hangs over everything. Did the church protect one of its own? For 45 years, the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl has haunted Toledo. This May marks 20 years since the trial that finally convicted her killer. But after reviewing thousands of pages of records and interviewing more than a dozen people tied to this case, it became clear to us that this story is about much more than just one murder. It's also about what happened after detectives focused on a priest. Why did the case go cold for nearly a quarter century? And did powerful people inside the Catholic Church help protect one of their own? Right now, we take a new look at one of the most disturbing and consequential criminal cases in Toledo history. This is Her Name Was Sister Margaret Ann.
And this is the farm that Sister Margaret Ann would have grown up on out north of Edgerton here. It's a 200-acre farm.
Sister Margaret Ann Pahl was murdered one day before her 72nd birthday.
She was a very kind, gentle, caring person, and she was very meticulous, very organized person, and she just she loved people. That was her goal. She always wanted to help people. She was in many supervisory capacities, and I think she took that to heart. Maybe it was a little strict at times. Some people might say that, but she wanted people to do their job and do the right thing.
Of course, you always wonder who did it.
The timeline of April 5th, 1980, inside Mercy Hospital, is preserved in police notes. Small timestamps that become the backbone of a mystery. Sister Margaret Ann enters the dining room around 6:10 a.m. She eats, leaves, returns, and is last seen leaving the dining room again around 6:50. A witness later reports hearing a loud noise from the chapel area at 7. At 7:30, that same witness reports hearing footsteps running in an upstairs hallway.
It was very traumatic to me.
And at 8:20, another nun, Sister Madeline Marie Gordon, enters the sacristy and finds Sister Margaret Ann.
I walked over and observed her, and I had to even bend over to see who it was. I was in there for a matter of seconds, and I ran out and screamed.
Investigators document what they find. Sister Margaret Ann's clothing disturbed, her underwear pulled down.
About the possibility.
Prosecutors later described the attack as strangulation, followed by 31 stab wounds.
That someone took her by the neck and choked her. Choked her so hard that 2 bones in the side of her neck broke.
Days later, Sister Margaret Ann is buried.
It shows Father Robinson officiating the funeral.
Father Gerald Robinson delivers the homily.
When the invitation was extended, I was sitting directly over the place where Sister Margaret Ann's life violently and tragically ended. A violent, tragic, traumatic death. A death not only blasphemous, but patently absurd. It stirs up within us a deep repugnance at death.
During the funeral, family members remember something else, something almost cinematic. A storm erupts, the chapel is rocked by a heavy rain, and the doors blow open.
The chapel illuminated, the windows along the side were being pelted with water or maybe hail, I don't know. There was a glass dome on top, I believe there was a cross on top. That thing was just shaking and rattling. The back doors to the chapel blew open.
A relative turns to the family and says what some will privately believe for decades. The priest did it.
After that day and from then on, he felt that Father Robinson was guilty.
In the days after the murder, investigators focus hard on Father Robinson.
The detectives on the case said that within 10 days, they had narrowed it down to one suspect. They started out with, dozens of them, and just because of the timing and locations of where everybody was and the type of crime it was, they just said that Robinson was their only suspect.
But the moment that echoes the loudest is what happens on April 19, 1980.
And they thought potentially they had him maybe ready to confess. When there was a knock on the door, they were in there for a little bit, talked to Father Robinson, they brought him out of the room, left the building, and that ended the investigation.
Father Robinson is free to go, and the entire murder investigation is over in 3 weeks flat.
And for 24 years, the community debates who knows the truth about who murdered Sister Margaret Ann Pahl.
I would love to know the truth. Everybody always asks, is there one day in history you'd go back to? It's not the birth of Christ, it's not the day JFK got shot, it's April 5th, 1980. I want to know what happened that day.
When we come back, the letter that would reopen the investigation more than 2 decades after the murder, and the moment a Catholic priest was led away in handcuffs. On June 11, 2003, a woman appears before the Diocese of Toledo's Review Board after sending them a letter. She describes ritual abuse spanning decades.
At the age of 5, a ceremony was performed at Calvary Cemetery. I was put into a coffin-like pine box, and cockroaches were released into the box. I was in the box for several minutes and thought I was going crazy. They told me the bugs marked me for Satan. One of these sadomasochistic perpetrators was Father Gerald Robinson.
We really do care that these cases are not sitting on a shelf somewhere gathering dust.
The letter makes its way to people who have a job built for cases like this. Prosecutor Julia Bates' cold case team, a team she built in the late 1990s. It's a group that solved the Cook brothers' serial killings, murders that also began in 1980.
We said, we have to do this. We're going to do this cold case. And then we said, how many other cold cases could we do? How many other cases are there that we now could look at with new eyes? Not only DNA, but maybe other technology that we didn't have. And it was amazing. I mean, it truly was. It took off and we solved so many cases and brought closure to so many people. I get the chills talking about it.
Tom Ross and Steve Forrester look at the file again, this time with those fresh eyes, modern testing, and a willingness to reopen evidence many assumed would never be touched again.
The accusations in the letter were pretty extreme, and some of them hard to accept as being true. But just his name stuck out. Based on that, Steve and I decided to look at the case.
Tom Ross was a detective in Toledo who had retired and then joined the cold case squad. He had been on the force in 1980 when the murder happened and initial investigation was conducted. He wasn't on the team of detectives that looked into it in 1980, but he remembers a talk around the office saying that, you know, there was only one suspect, and it was Father Gerald Robinson.
An interview with the letter writer points them towards something specific: the possibility of the stab wounds forming an upside-down cross on Sister Margaret Ann's chest.
They have the altar cloth that was laid over Sister. And Terry Cousineau looks at the altar cloth, and what does he see in the altar cloth but the upside-down cross that was mentioned in the nun's letter?
4 distinct corners to it.
Cousineau, the visual whiz of the cold case team, later discusses the moment in court.
Looking at this pattern, not only did it fit the form of a cross, the symmetry and the precision of it would suggest to me that something was used as a template.
Prior to this case, in your involvement,
Father Jeffrey Grob, an expert on Catholic rituals, tells detectives the killer was carrying out a ritualistic ceremony.
It's an image of penetration. In a sense, you're stabbing something through the sacred. Blood is involved. It's a mockery. I mean, the inverted cross on the person is a mockery to God. It's a mockery to the person.
But investigators and prosecutors eventually decide they will not build their entire case around symbolism, despite an interesting find in Father Robinson's living quarters.
It was a satanic book and some satanic ritual stuff. And I said, you know, folks, Toledo they're not going to buy this. This is just way too crazy. You know, maybe there was satanic stuff going on, but let's not go there.
But police zero in on the object that will become the center of everything: a letter opener taken from Father Robinson's desk back in 1980.
There was a medallion on the letter opener, and that medallion showed up in the blood on the altar cloth. I mean, it was just very, very persuasive.
And in April 2004, Ross confronts Father Robinson.
And you had to have killed Sister with this knife. Father, why do you smirk at me? I mean, this is serious.
I'm not smirking at you. I don't know how all this is about. Because I was not there. I was not there.
Father, how do we explain this knife causing those puncture wounds and leaving those transfer marks on that altar cloth? She stabbed through that altar cloth with a perfect crucifix on the chest, upside down, the long part of this under her chin, and the short part of the cross towards the middle of her abdomen. What's that all about?
That I don't know.
But police say Robinson also lied about hearing a confession and wasn't truthful about his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Later that day, Father Gerald Robinson is arrested for murder.
I don't think he did that. It's just not, it's so out of character for him.
If it was him that did this, it's terrible. And the fact, it's kind of scary, actually.
Shockwaves go through the city, and parishioners bail Robinson out of jail.
And I know Father would say, don't do it, because he's that kind of a person. Whatever can help him, and if I can get more, I will. I'll just quit my spending or something else.
I was sitting in my cubicle, and Chris Hall came up, and she was the police reporter, and she asked me if I knew anything about a Father Gerald Robinson. I said, why do you ask? And she goes, well, I think he's about to be arrested. I said, arrested for what? And she goes, murder. And I said, murder? I almost fell out of my chair.
He's clinging to his faith.
Defense attorney John Thebes gets a call from a priest he knows. The request is simple: talk to the family. He agrees, and at his kitchen table the next day, he's asked to take the case.
I think he'd been arrested on a Friday. They came over on a Saturday, right here at the kitchen table, and asked me to take the case.
He meets Robinson in the jail.
He was a very confused man who didn't have a friend in the world at the jail.
Thebes says the reality of defending a cold case hits immediately. While the government has had decades to test evidence and revisit theories, the defense starts late, trying to catch a train that left the station 24 years earlier.
We're running a race where the government is halfway finished by the time we even get the discovery.
But investigators believe they need something stronger than just theories and timelines. They want a physical link between the letter opener and the wounds. With the family's permission, Bates authorizes the exhumation of Sister Margaret Ann.
The holes in the altar cloth were made by something that had the same tip as the letter opener. But wouldn't it be better to have her body? And if we could do that, we should do that. This was from them. They were the experts. So of course, if we can do that, we should do that. And so we did that.
We did a secondary autopsy, and that was when Dr. Scala Barnett, the coroner at the time, excised a portion of her mandible and discovered a defect that ultimately was a perfect fit for the tip of the letter opener. And as she testified, it fit like a key in a lock.
Once again, we are brought forth with the loss that saddened us 24 years ago. The loss of a woman who was a person of service to our community and helping others.
Sir, do you have any comments on the case?
In late April 2006, Toledo becomes the center of an unprecedented case. A Catholic priest on trial, accused of killing a Catholic nun.
It was a circus. When they talk about a circus, they were tents all over the lawn and the trucks and the, court TV and all of these people.
This is a murder charge with a dead victim, and somebody did it.
In order to convict anyone, has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Even before the first witness, both sides face the same challenge, finding 12 people willing to be fair.
We certainly had a number of jurors who said they could never convict a priest. I remember one saying, no, a priest sits on the right hand of God. Another one said he's the Lord's messenger here on earth. And another one said, no, I could never believe a priest was capable of this.
But society's view of the Catholic Church had changed dramatically since the time of the murder in 1980. At the time of the 2006 trial, multiple dioceses across the country and in Toledo reached settlements with abuse victims, emboldened by the Boston Globe's spotlight investigation of the Boston Church.
If Gerald Robinson had been a janitor in 1980, he most likely would have been charged, tried, and convicted in 1980. On the other hand, if he had been indicted and was a priest in 1980, it's probably unlikely you'd get 12 jurors that would have voted guilty. But people's mindsets and views on the church and religious figures and priests in particular changed after the turn of the millennium.
It's a major issue for the defense.
That was even a concern of why they even arrested him in the first place. Did the government feel that now the time is right because of the scandal to go and arrest him?
In my opinion, the biggest problem trying to prepare for the case was just the attention to it and the outside thoughts about the case, not from us, from the lawyers, but from the general public.
And we believe that the evidence proves exactly who's responsible for this crime. The first goal in this case was to be able to prove that the letter opener was the murder weapon.
But the defense keeps returning to the evidence they believe should stop the case cold. Male DNA found beneath Sister Margaret Ann's fingernails is DNA that is not Father Robinson's.
Now think about this. A nun who lives at the hospital with other nuns gets up in the morning, goes to breakfast at a cafeteria at the hospital, sits by herself, and goes to the chapel. No interaction with a male whatsoever. And we have male DNA underneath her fingernails.
The DNA does not identify another suspect. It does not solve the case by itself, but it becomes the defense's clearest question for jurors. How does that DNA get there?
This isn't an average person who's going out, to the club or going out where she's around a bunch of people and might run into them and get somebody's fingernail. I mean, you have to have somebody's male bloody DNA under your fingernails. And she's a nun, and she lives her life in Mercy Hospital.
The only one I can think of is because she scratched him. And she scratched him trying to defend herself. That literally is the only I can think anybody, not just this case. You don't walk around with the skin of another human being under your fingernails by accident.
You have to understand, in 1980, DNA evidence as we know today was completely unknown. I don't think it was first used in a criminal case until the mid-1980s and really didn't come to full fruition until the 1990s. People were not gloved, they were not gowned when they went into that sacristy.
The defense also challenges a murder weapon. They argue prosecutors cannot prove the letter opener made the wounds.
Not one expert, not one with any credibility anyway, came in here and said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the weapon.
Instead, they focus on what was missing from the chapel, Sister Margaret Ann's scissors.
We had an expert who said that it was very possible that it was a pair of scissors, which was the one thing that was missing from the scene was Sister Margaret's scissors that she used to cut the wicks for services. That was something that was missing. That was an aha moment that John Thebes had one night late.
I said, what household item does that look like to you? And she said,
While talking on the phone to his mom, he drops a blood transfer report prepared by an expert.
The report fell from my lap onto the floor. And I looked at that picture differently when it was on the floor than I did when it was, either at my desk or my lap. Kind of like you see things in a cloud that maybe you didn't originally. And when it fell on the floor, I saw a pair of scissors. I saw a unique long blade.
But in the jury's mind, it's a Hail Mary. The state simply reminds them of Father Robinson's lies.
We don't expect priests to kill, do we? But do we expect them to lie to the police during a murder investigation? Who lies to the police during a murder investigation? Maybe the one who did the crime?
A juror's notes obtained by 11 investigators showed the letter opener is the deciding factor. After weeks of testimony and argument, the jury deliberates for about 6 hours over 2 days. Defense attorneys watch the jurors return.
Alan told me what I knew in my heart as we watched them came out.
And he said, this isn't good.
Exactly.
Father Gerald Robinson is found guilty of murder.
With the jury, will the defendant rise? Find the defendant guilty of murder.
Father Robinson is sentenced to 15 years to life.
All the media was assembled and we made statements and took their questions.
The jury has spoken, and unfortunately that's the way it is.
And after that, we went to the jail to see him and talk to him about next steps and what had happened, and I told him I was sorry.
He would have to have the coincidence.
Robinson's appeals continue for years.
Contrary to many other people, I'm absolutely convinced he was innocent. And this small, timid man with very petite features. I mean, I could put my hand and circle his wrist without any difficulty. And yet he supposedly stabbed this nun to death 30-some times.
But sitting here today, looking back, You think he was 100% innocent?
Yes. Without hesitation.
It's not what defense counsel.
In July 2014, his appellate attorney visits him in hospice at the Franklin Medical Center.
He was resigned. I mean, he had his Catholic belief firmly in his hand as he's passing on. He's ready to get to the good side. And he wasn't resentful. He felt, I think, that having been down in that area, the hospice section, he had a chance to talk to some of the other dying prisoners.
Robinson dies days later on July 4th, 2014. His conviction stands. A priest convicted of killing a nun. For many people, the verdict ends the mystery, but for others, the conviction sharpened a central question. Why did it take so long, and what did the church know?
It needs to come down. It's needed to come down.
Yeah.
20 years. We've been asking the same thing for 20 years.
It's been long enough, that's for sure.
That's right.
So, yep.
Two people bound by decades of unanswered questions, and what they say is painful betrayal. Claudia Versalati and Lee Pahl visit a sign honoring Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, a priest they say helped bury the truth.
The Toledo Catholic Diocese was a part of the problem, and they should be a part of the solution. Toledo has this horrible distinction of having the first Roman Catholic priest convicted of murdering a nun, and then they honor the person that helped obstruct the entire murder investigation, delaying justice for over 24 years.
It is clear that within days of the killing in 1980, investigators focused on Father Robinson. Deputy Chief Ray Vetter later testifies there were no other suspects.
Was there anyone else considered a prime suspect other than the defendant, Gerald Robinson?
Objection.
Sir, what's your answer to that?
No.
Police believe they have their man, but during a police interview with Robinson, Deputy Police Chief Ray Vetter arrives, accompanied by Monsignor Jerome Schmidt.
They had him, they had the murder weapon. There were so many components, but it just all ended when Monsignor Schmidt, accompanied by Ray Vetter, plucked him out of the interrogation room.
The question isn't only what was said in that room, it's what it signaled. That church leadership could be present and that police leadership permitted it.
I talked to some policemen that worked in Toledo in 1980, and they said you could not arrest a priest. It was just impossible. If you tried to arrest a priest for anything, the police chief would go to the bishop, no charges would be filed, the bishop would take care of it, and the priest would be sent away or moved or whatever, but there was never any official charges.
Documents obtained by 11 investigators show the diocese was being kept informed about developments in the investigation. Now, is there any circumstance, in your opinion, where a police chief or a police official should talk to the boss of a suspect and tell him what's going on in that investigation?
Well, and that's what I asked Monsignor, is that standard policy to be discussing the inner thoughts of the police department with the suspect's employer? But he denied that he made those statements, but couldn't explain why that information was in that letter.
Years later, a witness tells investigators she saw Father Robinson leaving the chapel that morning. She says she reported what she saw to Bishop James Hoffman.
And did he ask you which priest it was?
Mm-hmm.
And did you tell him?
Just the skinny one.
Okay.
Little skinny, that I don't like.
Okay. And how did he react to that?
He didn't say anything. He says, that's part of our secret. You don't tell anybody anything about that day.
And Lester told investigators she kept that information private for decades. A cleaning employee also says she saw Robinson leaving the chapel.
She saw Gerald Robinson walk out of the chapel doors, robed up, carrying a black satchel, and he walked right by her. She also indicated that she had been told by others she should keep this to herself.
And then there are the reports that appear to have vanished.
Detective Marks, who was the lead detective, who I had known for years, just top-notch, excellent detective, he had said, of course I did reports regarding my interview with Gerald Robinson, but they're all gone. So I had no doubt that he did do these reports.
The case grows cold until June 11, 2003, when a woman appears before the Diocese Sexual Abuse Review Board. She describes ritualistic abuse and mentions Father Robinson. Within 24 hours, a letter from the diocese attorney to its own board states the matter had already been investigated. That attorney's letter surprises Mandros. He was part of the prosecutor's team reviewing abuse claims.
That doesn't make sense time-wise.
A second letter, 2 weeks later, expresses concern about the idea of the allegations being taken to prosecutors. 2 months after Robinson is indicted for murder, investigators seek church records on the priest. They are provided only a few pages.
So the Catholic Church is required by its own law to keep secret files that they can't even talk about. So when a policeman comes and asks, files a warrant, search warrant to get these files, the church would not even acknowledge that these files exist.
Frustrated, investigators escalate. They seek no-knock warrants to access the church's secret archives, something police believe have existed since the early 1900s.
For somebody that had been a priest for 40 years, look in my personnel file and see what's in there. There's a lot of stuff in there from a lot of years, a lot of trials, a lot of good letters and some not so nice. And there was nothing in his, nothing about this case. Like, where was it?
4 months after Robinson is indicted for murder, investigators recover more than 100 pages of personnel notes, but nothing documenting any internal church investigation into the murder of Sister Margaret Ann.
We found it unusual that when you have a priest charged with a homicide and you had decades earlier a nun murdered in one of your chapels, you would think there'd be files about that, there'd be records about that, but there was nothing. It had been cleansed. Some opined that all that went to the Vatican.
11 investigators contacted the diocese 4 times, requesting interviews or written responses. The diocese declined an interview and provided a written statement. Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's tragic death occurred 45 years and 3 bishops ago. Father Gerald Robinson was convicted 20 years ago and died before the current bishop, Daniel E. Thomas, was installed. The Diocese of Toledo today cannot speak to the decision made so long ago by either civil authorities or by the local church. Mandros says what stands out most is what never happened.
After the initial flurry of police investigation and the prosecutor's office decided at the time there wasn't enough evidence, the diocese never once reached out to the police department or the prosecutor's office and inquired about the status of the investigation as to who killed this nun in this chapel. Never once.
When Father Robinson dies in 2014, he's given a full funeral mass. His title is never stripped.
They want to give him a full priestly send-off, so be it, but it just seems like another indignation and slap at this poor woman.
We've been asking the same thing for 20 years.
It's been long enough.
For Monsignor Schmidt, athletic fields and signs still bear his name. Multiple city leaders have refused to remove them, a fight that continues for Versalati and Lee Paul.
So when I look at that and I think of the sworn testimony at the trial and so on, why?
And I understand he did a lot of great things in Toledo and for people, but he failed Sister Margaret Ann Pahl, and she was no less a child of God.
Just days before this documentary was released, another severe storm swept through the area, bringing down trees and damaging Calvary Cemetery, where Father Gerald Robinson is buried. Groundskeepers said it's the worst damage in years. At Father Robinson's gravesite, a damaged angel lay with a broken wing. Lee told us that the timing was not a coincidence, and it took him back to the storm at his aunt's funeral.
When finished with the Mass, we were taking the casket out. They opened the doors to go out, and things had subsided, and there was a big, beautiful rainbow out there.
I know my sister is in heaven.
This is Sister Margaret Ann. This is my father, and this would be her parents, and then the siblings. There was 9 in the family. There were 5 girls and 4 boys. And she was the 4th oldest. She was a registered nurse, a science teacher, supervisory positions in different hospitals over the years. She was the administrator of Mercy Hospital in Tiffin. She was the administrator of St. Charles Hospital in Toledo. I just remember her as a kind, gentle person. She had a radiant smile.
Her name was Sister Margaret Ann, and Lee hopes no one ever forgets.
You just finished watching the documentary. Her name was Sister Margaret Ann. I'm Melissa Andrews, investigative anchor, along with lead investigator Brian Duggar here at WTOL 11 News. Brian really spent a lot of time digging into this, so we thought it would be a great idea to share some of the behind the scenes and the whys and the hows with you guys who just enjoyed this documentary. Brian, people may ask, why did you decide to do this documentary? It's been 46 years since Sister Margaret Ann was killed.
Yeah, you know, I came to Toledo in 1998, and this has always been one of those cases that just kind of sticks out. And it just happens that May is like the 20-year anniversary of Father Robinson being convicted. So I just wondered, you know, I'm like, I wonder if we can get all the police files and what kind of information we can get to put this together.
And it's not just you that's been fascinated by this. I mean, when we looked at the trial, obviously media from all over the world were interested in this. This is the only known, correct me if I'm wrong, conviction of a priest in a nun's murder.
It is the only one that I can find, and I've looked a lot.
Mm-hmm. And in putting together something like this, you really need to, as an investigator or as a reporter, you need to make sure all that the key players that were involved then, that know the parties involved, will speak to us. We talked to Lee Pahl originally, and one of the things that stuck out to me about Lee is he said, you know, Melissa, I've done so many interviews on this topic. It's really important to me that we hone in on the Catholic Church here. And obviously we need Lee to tell who Sister Margaret Ann was.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we had to work and build that relationship before we could put this whole thing together. Because if we don't have any family members, and she doesn't have many family members who are still alive, if we don't have any family members, we can't really tell this story like we wanted to. So as you just saw in that documentary, I mean, he clearly believes that there's a cover-up from not only the police department, but also the Catholic Church. And he was very adamant that he wanted to tell that story.
And I don't think that's a stretch to make a deal like that, that yes, we will explore that possibility. It's just whether you're going to be able to find people who will admit that on camera or allude to that, right?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, look, this story has been told 20 different times, and a lot of them are in the same way, you know, focusing on the satanic ritual aspect of it, the trial aspect. but not too many people. I don't know if anybody else has truly explored the church cover-up and the police cover-up angle. So it was not a stretch at all for us to do that, and actually kind of sparked a good, yeah, you know, that's a good idea. We should attack it from that direction.
You really can't tell the story without talking about the alleged Catholic cover-up part of it. But also, I think the way that the story's been told in the past is so much about Father Robinson, and I think we made a deliberate effort here to make it more about who was Sister Margaret Ann. That's why, hence the title of the documentary.
Absolutely, and we had many meetings where we said, look, we want to focus on her life. She's very accomplished. I mean, she was a hospital administrator, a nursing supervisor.
And I don't think people really knew that. They had the assumption that, okay, or maybe not the assumption, maybe all that's really been reported was that she was, you know, a little older nun who, you know, just put together the chapel for services there in a hospital. But she was very accomplished, and she was an administrator in a hospital, and she was a tough woman.
Absolutely. And, you know, and we were talking, when I sat down with Lee, you know, people had told me beforehand, you have to get him to tell you about the storm that happened during Sister Margaret Ann's funeral. And I thought that was a key part of the documentary, but we have another soundbite that actually kind of expands on that a little bit. So let's listen to that.
There was nothing in the forecast, I don't believe, that day. But we were in there, and as the funeral was taking place, and to throw in the tidbit there, Father Gerald Robinson was the celebrant for the Mass for my aunt. And we were somewhere in the process of the funeral Mass, and this horrific storm blew up. I mean, it was bad. The chapel illuminated, the windows along the side were being pelted with water or maybe hail, I don't know. There was a glass dome on top, I believe there was a cross on top. That thing was just shaking and rattling, and everybody was just kind of doing one of these numbers. The back doors to the chapel blew open, and leaves blew in, and yeah, everybody was just sitting there thinking, okay, is this roof coming off this chapel? And when we finished with the Mass, we were taking the casket out. They opened the doors to go out, and things had subsided, and there was a big, beautiful rainbow out there.
You said a couple interesting things there. You know that Father Robinson celebrated the Mass at the funeral of the woman that he had just killed days before. I mean, that is crazy. And
at the time, okay, if you're Lee, at the time, you don't know that he killed your aunt, and you're seeing this force of nature happening, but certainly looking back, he knows.
Yeah, and what was interesting, you know, he said in the documentary that, you know, when the storm happened, one of the family members turned to the other family members and said, I think Father Robinson killed her, because it was such a freak storm. It wasn't in the forecast, so nobody was expecting this. And right during the service, I mean, it just starts rattling the church. And you know, right before we released this documentary, we also had that really freak storm that damaged Calvary Cemetery. And, you know, I remember that morning we had heard about, you know, a cemetery had been damaged. And, you know, I was watching it on the news and I'm like, oh my gosh, what cemetery? And it was Calvary Cemetery, which is where Father Robinson was buried. So, you know, we go out there, we get footage, and we see this little angel at the cemetery, and it's like destroyed. And
next to his headstone.
His headstone, right next to his headstone. And I had talked to some groundskeepers, and I said, does you guys often get storm damage in the cemetery? And they're like, we've never seen anything like this in the last 10, 15 years. So, you know, make of that what you will. But when you have this funeral storm, and then you have this storm right before the documentary aired, it kind of makes you think.
Well, one of the things that you have to lay out with this documentary is the investigation and how that happened. And really, we're talking about two separate time frames. We're talking about 1980 when Sister Margaret Ann was murdered, and then the actual investigation that succeeded with his conviction, which was pretty much 2004. And for that, you need two key characters, current Lucas County Prosecutor Julia Bates and Judge Dean Mandros, and both of them at the time were the prosecutors on the case. And we had a meeting with them, and they were a little bit hesitant, I would say, to do this documentary. They wanted to know, what are you trying to accomplish sometimes, especially with the religious aspect, the Diocese of Toledo, what are we dredging up here? And so we had those conversations with them.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty intimidating. We actually had them up in the conference room, and I had to give this little presentation and say, hey, this is our vision. This is why we want to do this. And again, just like Lee, you know, so many documentaries have been done about this. They're like, we don't want to keep rehashing this thing that happened 20 years ago. But we told them we really wanted to look at the Catholic Church cover-up and to kind of point out what Sister Margaret Ann, what her life meant. And they seemed to buy into that. So, you know, we had, you know, hour-long conversations with Julia Bates and Judge Dean Mandros. And Julia actually talks here about how this investigation all got started.
Take a look.
You know, and they had him at the police station. They had him in the polygraph room, and bingo, you know, all of a sudden, knock on the door, and we're done here, and that's it. And the case went cold from that day on. So the letter comes. I think it's all very ironic, and that is, I guess, part of the uniqueness of the story, that you just can never know what is going to happen that's going to cause you to think about something and to take action that results in this kind of a result. So the way that I recall it is the committee at the diocese got the letter. They thought it was goofy and crazy and weren't going to do anything with it. One of the members of that committee was a psychologist who said, no, I don't agree with that, and I'm going to resign from the committee, but I don't think that this is not nothing. Somebody should look at this. It sounds crazy, but you know, truth is crazier than fiction sometimes. And it went to the Attorney General's office, then it came here, and yeah, the letter mentions Father Robinson, and we're like, whoa, you know, here's somebody that's bringing him up in another vein. We didn't know anything about this nun. This is a totally different nun from the nun that was murdered. And I said, we have a cold case unit, let's look at it.
So I want to dissect this a little bit because Prosecutor Bates starts talking. She's referencing a big moment that Claudia Versalati from SNAP and Lee Pahl, Sister Margaret Ann's nephew, really wanted to touch on in the documentary, and that was this Catholic cover-up. So Prosecutor Bates does talk about this at first. She's talking about having Father Robinson in the police station, in the polygraph room. There's a knock on the door, and she's saying, Monsignor Jerome Schmidt saying, we're done here, pulls him out, and pretty much, not just because of this, but other reasons that have been alleged involving the police department, this case goes cold.
Yeah, pretty much that was the last time the police really talked to Father Robinson. And, you know, I mean, they're never going to come out and directly criticize the church. But I think in the investigation, I think everybody kind of understands that, you know,
played a role.
Church got involved.
And you point out very well in the documentary that times change between the original investigation and the subsequent investigation. Let's get into this letter. So this letter comes to the Toledo Diocese, which Prosecutor Bates kind of, they brushed it off. And did they hand that letter over to the prosecutor, though?
Well, here's the thing, they didn't. There was somebody on the board, it was a psychologist, and I did talk to him. He didn't want to go on camera and talk about the experience, but he wanted to take it to the prosecutor's office. And he was essentially kicked off the board. And, you know, the diocese attorney reached out to this board, their own board, and said, look, knock it off. We're not taking this prosecutor. You don't have any right to take this to prosecutor. So he's the one that wanted to take it. So that essentially died. And eventually Claudia and Lee Pahl, they took the letter to the Ohio Attorney General's office.
Okay, and go ahead.
And the Ohio Attorney General's office kind of gave it to Lucas County. I think Tom Ross got it first.
And said, you're going to do something with this.
Yeah.
But this letter was so explosive, and you talked to the woman, I believe, who wrote the letter.
Yeah, I did.
Which started it all.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, reading the letter, and we did not print the entire letter because she didn't want the entire thing out there, but she was very adamant with me that, look, what's in the letter is what happened. You know, he abused me. He abused me in a very violent way. I never said that he killed Sister Margaret Ann, but I know based on what he did to me that he was probably capable of that. But, you know, there are other allegations in the letter of like these satanic ceremonies and, you know, some people read that and they're like, this is a bunch of craziness. What are we going to do with this? But, you know, look, I've had multiple communications with her. She's very prominent in the community. She does not strike me as someone who is crazy. It's still very vivid in her memory.
You know, it's interesting because Prosecutor Bates said in the documentary that basically they decided not to really go with the satanic theme in the trial because they were concerned that, you know, a jury just wouldn't be able to convict on something like that. And so we see that sometimes where they'll focus on something else, and really here they just focus straight on the murder, not the satanic thing. But it would be interesting if all these years later now, since that trial, if somehow that could get brought back into the fold. I mean, Father Robinson himself is dead, but this was alleged to have happened with a group of priests.
There were, and you know, I did not get into this, but the police department served warrants at a number of like barns and houses out in the Lucas County area where they were looking for evidence of you know, cult activity happening. And, you know, I don't think they ever found anything, but look, they believed that this was going on. And it was not, I mean, it was multiple priests that were allegedly involved in this.
So Father Robinson is convicted. You covered that in the documentary. He appeals. His attorney this time is Richard Kerger. And, you know, there's some question as to why Father Robinson never takes the stand.
Yeah, and I had this great interview with Richard Kerger. You know, he was not supposed to really be the lead attorney and the appellate attorney. And John Donahue, who's a really, you know, really sharp guy, fascinating. I mean, he had you know, just great knowledge of this case, and he really wanted to do something with us. And then during the middle of the appeals process, you know, he died. So Kerger ends up taking this over, and he builds this relationship with Father Robinson. And yeah, I mean, we discussed why didn't Father Robinson ever take the stand. And, you know, this is what he said.
I had signed on to be second mate, and suddenly I was the captain of the ship. And I felt woefully inadequate for the task compared to having John. He had encyclopedic knowledge of everything in that case. And it showed in the briefs he wrote. It was a pleasure working with him. I'm sorry he's gone. But I was there, and I wasn't going to back out of it. And so we did the best we could. And I came to really enjoy Father Robinson. He was very quiet. It took probably 5 or 6 years before I could get him to laugh at something I said. Maybe because I'm not very funny, but it nonetheless shows he was reticent. He was timid. And I think that was manifested in his appearance in the courtroom. He didn't testify. That was his decision. And frankly, he was terrified at speaking in public, which for a priest is odd, but that just bothered him. Now, I suppose somebody said, well, that was because he was guilty. No, it's just because he was terrified of it. And it's too bad, but that's what happened.
I mean, he just pointed that out. The first thought, how can you be a priest and be terrified of speaking in public? What are your thoughts on that juxtaposition there?
Well, I mean, that's very interesting, right? And I know multiple people who were in the courtroom during the time this whole trial was going on. And, you know, Father Robinson was portrayed as this, you know, frail old man who was very quiet and whatever. But, you know, somebody actually who was there told me the other day, they said, look, whenever the cameras were not looking at him, he would like stand upright and he would start, you know, kind of yelling at the camera, and he was very vocal. So, you know, I don't know. I mean,
So they're saying it was for the cameras, but there's still a jury he's got to try to impress, I guess, with this acting elderly thing, frail thing.
Yeah, and you know, the prosecutors, I mean, they actually put a picture of him up as like a 40-year-old because they didn't want the jury to view him as this frail old man.
Because he certainly wasn't at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And the defense, you know, alternatively, they wanted to make him look in court like, yeah, he's this old man who can barely walk and you know, he would never do something like this. So, you know, he's wearing his collar and, you know, I understand why both sides did what they did.
So obviously, you know, and it's explored at length here in the documentary. This was a circus, this trial was. There was media from all over the world here. It was certainly a big, big case. And we also have Dean Mandros, as we mentioned. He was one of the prosecutors on the case. He is a current judge here in the Toledo area. He talks about this circus and kind of just decompressing from all of this. So take a look at that.
I went home with my family and semi-collapsed just from near exhaustion. But yes, it was worldwide notoriety. And during the trial, I didn't have time to keep up with any of that. And about a week or so after, I'm at home on my computer reading news articles that bounced from the New York Times to a newspaper in Dublin, Ireland, to Rome, to the Middle East, to the Far East. And my eldest daughter walks by my computer screen and sees what I'm doing, and she turned and looked at me and said, "Dad, the trial's over." So I moved on to the next case.
Sounds like something my kids would say. What a great way to just say, okay, time to move on. But, you know, here he is all these years later reminiscing about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, we talked to 8 different people, and, you know, even though the murder happened, you know, more than 45 years ago and the trial was 20 years ago, you know, this is still very vivid in all their memories. So, yeah, I mean, I hope you enjoyed the documentary. We spent a lot of time on it.
What do you want people to take away from this?
Well, I mean, I want them to remember Sister Margaret Ann and who she was. Hopefully at some point the city can honor her. That's what I want them to take away from it. And, you know, yeah.
For Brian Duggar, I'm Melissa Andrews. You can watch Her Name Was Sister Margaret Ann at any time if you want to rewatch it or share it with someone else. That's on WTOL 11+.